Hey everybody, Zach Gilliland here. I'll be your extendly coach for today. Looking forward to getting into workflows today. We're going to kick this off with a Google slide presentation. All right. Okay, so today, over the next 15 to 20 minutes, we are going to cover a few different things. I'm going to give you guys just an overview of triggers, workflow triggers, and there's a few triggers in HighLevel that are similar in nature. And so we're going to discuss different triggers and kind of why you might use some versus others, which is how to select the right trigger. Then we have, we'll just do like kind of an overview of actions. And we won't get into every single action because this video would be way too long, but we can do other trainings on the various different actions inside of a workflow. If you guys would like to see that, just comment on the video, let me know. And then we have workflow global level send windows. So we'll talk about that as compared to sort of localized or individual weight windows and actions. We'll talk about when to use allow multiple in workflows, and then how to troubleshoot workflows and go through the status logs and all that kind of stuff. And then the importance of naming conventions. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to just stop my screen share here briefly so I can close the Google presentation. And I'm going to go to a live account just because I want to look at a workflow that actually has data in it here. And so we'll flip over there. So let me reshare my screen with you guys. Okay, so we're looking at a list of workflows. This is inside a live sub account called Midwest Fencing Company. And so let's just open a workflow that is pre-existing here, and we'll reference back to this list. So first, let's just do an overview of triggers. So inside of this workflow, we have a bunch of different triggers already in here, but I'm just going to click on new trigger so I can kind of show you guys the options. And so as you probably know at this point in time, if you're watching this video, there's a lot you can do inside HighLevel. It's an end-to-end platform for, marketing automation and communication management, customer relationship management. And so inside the triggers, when you're thinking about workflows, I just want you to think automation. That's really what workflow means, is you're going to set up something that the system does automatically. And so for you to do that, you have to tell the system, well, what's going to make this whole process start? What's going to make it begin? And so in this list of all these different triggers, typically the way that it works is you're going to select something that's broad, and then you're going to go down to something that's more specific. So what do I mean by that? Let's just use one of the triggers in the list here for, kind of as an example. And so in the spirit of keeping things the same as what's already going on in this workflow, we have a lot of pipeline stage changed triggers here. And so if we scroll down here, you can see the full list of triggers, and we're going to just scroll back up. And in the search bar up here, you can also search for triggers. And so what we can do is search for the same trigger type that we're already using in this workflow. And whenever you run a search like this, you can see it's returning one result. And then what you're seeing right here is the category that it's in. So if I erase this information here, see how when I search, it pops up and the category still remains. So it's opportunities is the category. So if we scroll down, see how our category here is opportunities, and then there's the one that we had searched for, pipeline stage change. Now, pipeline stage change, as I mentioned earlier, is a broad trigger. So if we were to use this trigger without doing anything else to it, then what that means is that anytime, anywhere, in any pipeline, on any pipeline stage, this workflow will begin. Now, typically you don't want a workflow to run like that, where it's so broad that it basically runs all the time for every potential reason. And so that is why you use filters to narrow down the reason that you want it to run to make it more specific. So if we add a filter here, you can see that we can select has tag or end pipeline, for example. And so this will be the most common filter that you would use with this workflow trigger type pipeline stage change, where you at least tell it what pipeline you want this workflow to fire off in. So if we were to just select this filter, then every time that there is a pipeline stage change in the acquisition pipeline, no matter what stage change that is, this workflow would begin. But we can get even more specific, and you'll see a layering of filters occur like this. And what do I mean by layering? If we go to add another filter right here, notice how it says pipeline stage, and that's something that just popped up. And that's because up here we selected a pipeline. So if we back out and I just go to add a new filter, notice how pipeline stage is not in here. That is because we first have to select is in pipeline. And then now that it knows what pipeline it's in, it can pull the stages. And so we can see all the stages in those pipelines. So this is a consistent pattern that happens with all workflow triggers. Well, just about. Some workflow triggers don't have too many filter options, but for the most part, you can layer your filters like this. And so it's worth kind of playing around with. It takes a little bit of time to sort of get all this in your brain, but it's worth playing around with different filter parameters for each trigger type inside of a workflow, so that you can kind of see like what filter layering options are available to you. And just basic UX here, you can see all the triggers are always going to go inside of this little gray area here. You can see like that gray background. And all the workflow actions are going to be below this like little arrow right here, down here. And so there could be videos, training videos for every single trigger type in this list for the most part. A few of them could get bundled together. But there's a lot in here. So, but those are the most important things on a broad level that you need to understand about the triggers is, there's an appointments bucket, an affiliate bucket, a contact bucket, contact actions bucket, events, Facebook membership area, opportunities, payments, Shopify, media, and TikTok. So those are all your trigger buckets. And so inside of each of those buckets, like if you take, for example, let's just say contact. So all these triggers are going to be related to the contact. So birthday reminders, contact changed, which this is one that I use a lot because that's anytime something changes on a contact, you can fire this workflow off if a contact gets created in the system, if a contact gets flagged as D&D on one of the channels, if a tag is added or removed from a contact, if there's a custom date that changes. So you have like date reminders, notes added, notes changed, tasks added, task reminders. So those are all pertaining to the contact. So every single bucket will have triggers that pertain to that area of the system. So once you've decided how the workflow is going to fire off, then you can start adding your actions, which tells the workflow what you want it to actually do when it does begin. So that's our overview of triggers, hopefully helping you kind of select the right trigger. Now, one other thing real quick before we move into this one down here, different triggers, different data. On the topic of how to select the right trigger, I just want to show you a few things that are similar. And so contact changed and contact created, there's a little bit of overlap there, but there's a specific kind of nuance here, which is a contact can't change if a contact doesn't yet exist. And so that's an example of, you need to understand some of the nuance between trigger types that have a little bit of overlap. Let me give you another example. appointment status, and customer booked appointment. So let me just show you this one so it makes more sense. So appointment status. So we could tell this workflow to fire off when there's an event created in a calendar that's normal. Let's say it's in calendar, book an estimate, and the appointment status is confirmed. So that will fire off this workflow every single time an appointment gets confirmed. Now, instead of appointment status, let's say that we did customer booked appointment. We do the same thing in calendar, booked an estimate. Now notice how like appointment status is not now an option in here. So this is going to fire off whenever the calendar widget is used. So not when you book it inside HighLevel in the system, but when it's been booked through the calendar widget. Now, I also believe that this customer booked appointment trigger will fire off in the event of some automations running directly to the calendar. This is currently a hypothesis that I'm testing. So Google LSA ads, for example, I believe trigger the customer booked appointment trigger to fire in a workflow. But when I say there's some overlap, the customer booked appointment trigger will fire off when the calendar widget is used to book the appointment. But if you had another trigger that was appointment status is confirmed, then that trigger is also going to fire. And if you have both of these triggers in a workflow, they're gonna duplicate up on each other, and that person's gonna be added to the workflow 2 times. And so this is where you need to sort of understand that there is some overlap, between some of these trigger types. And so here's another one: order submitted, order form submitted. So if we go to order submitted, let's look at our filters. So global product, let's say order source is order form. Okay. And then we can add another filter for, is it in funnel or website? What's the submission type? So let's say submission type is bump, primary, upsell. So we could do primary and funnel and website, and there's not going to be any options here. Oh no, there is landing, pages. Let's just say landing. Could start layering our filter as product is, and there's no products in the system. And so in the event, so this trigger gives you the option to where it says order source is, if you had multiple different forms, you could, add all these filter layers, to this trigger type. And then let's see, global product is, I don't have any global products in the system, but so there's this order submitted, but then we also have order form, and check this out. Whoopsie. Not an action, need a trigger. So order form submitted is going to give us very similar filter parameters. The difference is that we cannot select like a global product. So that's the only difference in the filter type here as far as the layering options. So play around with some of the trigger types that seem similar to you, test them, make sure they're working for your use case. You're not getting any weird behavior or anything that's happening with people being added to a workflow twice or something like that. But it's very important which trigger you choose. And so choose carefully. All right, moving on. Different triggers, different data. So inside of a workflow, we have all kinds of different triggers that we can use. And I'm not going to say a ton about this, but I just want you guys to understand that when you use a trigger, later down in the workflow, you might want to reference the information that's being passed into the workflow from that trigger. So for example, if we were to use a calendar trigger, like we were just looking at, like appointment status is confirmed, if you use that trigger type, then the date of the appointment will be made available to you in the workflow. So like if I was to go down here and just add an action and select wait as the action, If we were working with a calendar type of trigger, then I could wait for an event appointment time. But if I select this event appointment time wait in this workflow where there's no event-based data right now, then this wait event is not even going to work. It's just going to fail out. It'll skip over it if there's no data. And so it's the same thing where let's say you want to interact with the order information. If somebody submitted an order or paid an invoice, and there's going to be payment data and all that kind of stuff, or form data. Like if somebody submits a form, then that data will be made available inside the workflow to use in actions. And so strategically, you need to think about, well, what data do I need to interact with in the actions of the workflow? Because that data will be made available to you when you use a trigger with that pulls that data into the workflow. And there are some like special cases like calendar appointments where you really need to be careful about that. You need the event appointment data inside that workflow to build like reminders for appointments and all of that type of stuff. All right, so then we have workflow global level send windows. So if we go into this workflow into the settings, notice how right now it says communication management time window. And then right now it's anytime. It says allow messages to be sent from the workflow anytime, or you could select specific time. And then it says restrict actions from being sent outside the window that you define. And if we were to select this, then it's going to allow us to choose like a wait window. Now, if we go back to our actions and we go down and we go to add like a wait action, notice how if we switch on advanced window, we can also set like a wait time box right here. And so this gives you more granular control over like, well, which actions in my workflow do I want to wait to certain time boxes, and which time boxes do I want to wait till? You might choose, it doesn't even have to be a box. It can also, instead of a window, it can be an exact time, like just wait till 9 a.m. So if you do it this way, you have more granular control. However, if you're wanting to just make sure that no communication is going to go out outside of your time window, it's going to be a little bit easier to just implement a specific time window on the entire workflow. But sometimes you might still want some messages to go out, let's say to you as an internal team member, or other things to happen in the workflow outside of the time window. And so you can, instead of doing a time window in the whole workflow, you can just restrict only certain messages from going to customers or clients within that time window. Then we have when to use allow multiple. So while we're here in the settings, you can see this allow multiple switch turned on. This is by default turned off inside of workflows. But what this switch allows you to do is tell the workflow that you want the same contact to be able to pass into the workflow multiple times. Now, there's going to be certain workflows where you don't want that to happen. Like, let's say communication workflows, like nurture workflows, you don't want people getting double messages. So you don't want them to be in a nurture workflow twice. But in this case, for example, this is a routing workflow. This workflow fires off every single time there's a pipeline stage change. And so naturally, a contact is going to be in the each stage of the pipeline, theoretically, until they get to the end. And every single time they move to a different stage, this workflow is going to fire off again, and they're going to re-enter this workflow. So for that reason, we need to turn on allow multiple. If we had it off, then the first time they made it through this workflow and then they finished, when the system tried to add them, when one of these triggers fired for a second time, then it would block them from being able to be added to the workflow because allow multiple is not enabled. Allow multiple is also helpful if you are just wanting to test so that you can add yourself to a workflow over and over and over again. So a lot of times when we're building workflows, we'll have allow multiple turned on. And then if it's a workflow where we don't want allow multiple to be turned on when it goes live, then we'll switch it off, and then publish it with it turned off, obviously. Okay, now we have troubleshooting workflows. So this workflow is a good one to look at. And let me just back out of here real quick, though, just so I make sure I didn't save anything that we just did. We'll go into the pipeline router yet again. And so this is an area where a lot of people get lost. Something in a workflow will happen that you didn't expect or couldn't predict. And people get lost kind of trying to figure out like, well, where did people go in the workflow? What happened? All that kind of stuff. So if that's you, let me show you how to look at a breadcrumb trail. So when you go to status in the workflow, you can see all the high level execution. So you can see the people that went through the workflow, and the time that they were added to the workflow, the current step that they're on. And then if there was another execution coming up, like a scheduled execution, you would actually see that right here. In fact, let's just look at one that, probably does have some scheduled executions coming up. So let's do, we need to find one where someone's active. And let me actually go to the next page here. So here's a calendar appointment workflow. We go to the status on this one. Let's see here. Do we have anybody waiting? Oh, wait. Let's go to the next. Oh, here we go. Actively enrolled. Okay, here we go. I was looking for somebody that's actively enrolled. Okay, so you can see here on this person's currently in the workflow. Their status is they're waiting for a time. This is the next execution. So when the workflow is going to, trigger the next action for this person. And if for some reason you wanted to manually force them to the next action, you could click on this little button right here to accelerate them to the next step. Or inversely, if you want to remove them from this workflow, you can stop all the stuff happening in the workflow by clicking on the little X. But the main reason why we're looking at this whole screen right here is because to get to your breadcrumb trail, you click on this icon and then you're going to go into the execution log. And so you just basically have to follow the path here. And so you can look, you can see they were added to the workflow. Then they had a wait event to wait 1 day. And then this workflow was skipped. And you can also view more details right here. And so you can see that it tried to add the contact to a workflow that they are already in, where allow multiple is not enabled. And so it failed out on adding them to that workflow, which is good. That's what we want it to do. So the system caught what would have been an error had we had allow multiple enabled on the other workflow. Then they waited a day and that finished, and an SMS was sent out to them. And you can see the status was delivered. If you click on this, it was a success. So then we have some more wait events, another SMS, and now they're in another wait event. And if you click on the wait events, you can see when the wait event was executed and when the wait event ends and the next workflow execution is coming up. So this is how you can find the errors or even just unexpected behavior that's happening inside of workflows, is by going through the audit log. There's this, sort of status trail here. Alrighty. So we just went through these troubleshooting workflows and workflow status logs. And then this is kind of in the same vein. The last thing I'll say is notice how when we're inside of this workflow, where it says action and it lists what's happening here, the actual naming conventions that we're using for these actions in the workflow are obviously what's showing up in status and the execution log. And so if we did not have good naming conventions for those actions, if we just left the standard naming convention. So for example, every time we go to create a new SMS in a workflow, if you just add SMS and then you add some stuff and you hit save, it's just going to say SMS, right? And then if you add another SMS, add some stuff and hit save, then it'll say SMS again. Well, if you were to look at that in your status, all you would see here is just wait, SMS, SMS, and you wouldn't have any clue what was going on in the audit trail. So it's essential to getting good data and you actually understanding what's happening in your workflows to give them a naming convention that makes sense. So when you go back and you see that, okay, this action happened, then that action happened, you can see, okay, well, which SMS fired off? Was it SMS 2 or SMS 1, SMS 5 or SMS 6? Which wait event fired off? Was it the 1 day wait event? was the 2-day wait event. And then that's how you can kind of follow the path, all the way through. And there's other reasons why naming conventions are important, just when you're looking in your workflow and being able to see, 2 months later after you built it, what exactly you did. It gets kind of hard to remember what you did unless you have a naming convention. We actually have a template that helps you with all of the stuff, with all the naming conventions, gives you a framework that you can use to name all the workflow actions. And that can be found in the Extendly community. So that's our high level overview for workflows today. Hope you enjoyed it. Comment on the video with any questions that you have or thoughts. And until then, I'll talk to you guys later.